Imagine, if you will, the year is 1960. Picture it. Much of Africa is, stepping onto the world stage, right? Fresh with that promise of independence. Southeast Asia, on the other hand, well, let's just say the picture there was a bit more complicated.
Indeed. Few at the time, I think, could have predicted the economic powerhouses, really, that many Asian nations would become.
It's a remarkable transformation. There's no doubt about that. And this report you shared, the Asian model, it really digs deep into that, the how and the why. But what I found really striking was this contrast with how Africa was perceived back then. And to some extent, you could argue even now.
It's a point, actually, that the report tackles head on. In the year 2000, The Economist, they had this famous cover, I'm sure you've seen it, dubbing Africa the hopeless continent.
Yeah.
But then, fast forward just 11 years, and the same publication, they're declaring Africa rising. So clearly something had shifted in the narrative, but the question is, had it shifted in reality?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it feels like this deep dive, at least from my perspective, it's about more than just, comparing GDP growth rates. This is about uncovering, I think, the underlying mechanics of success.
Precisely. It's about going beyond these broad stroke comparisons and really understanding the nuanced factors at play. Because while Africa, yes, can certainly learn and should learn from Asia's experiences, and this is a key point the report makes, it cautions against just trying to replicate, a so-called Asian model.
Because there isn't one single model, is there? Each nation, they charted their own course.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so fascinating. We're going to journey through these specific strategies of Japan, Singapore, South Korea, Vietnam, each one unique, yet all interwoven in this tapestry of Asian economic development.
Okay, let's start unraveling this tapestry then. First stop, Japan. Now picture this. It's 1945, the aftermath of World War II. Japan is, to put it mildly, devastated. You'd think their focus would be on rebuilding infrastructure, right? The tangible things.
A logical assumption, yes. But what Japan did was in many ways even more fundamental. They invested heavily in their people.
Education, right. The report really highlights this, but I'm curious, why was that so crucial for them specifically?
Because they recognized that to rebuild, they couldn't just rely on what had worked before the war. They needed innovation. They needed quality. And they understood that the foundation for both was a highly educated and skilled workforce.
And this wasn't just about, rote learning. This was about fostering a culture of continuous improvement. The report even mentions this fascinating story about an inventor, Sakichi Toyoda, and his automatic loom.
Ah, yes. Toyota's loom. It's a fantastic example of this principle in action. See, his invention wasn't just about making a faster loom. It was about baking in quality control. So the loom would actually stop automatically if a thread broke.
So instead of just churning out flawed products, they're designing for zero defects right from the get-go.
Precisely. And this wasn't just some, isolated invention. It reflected this broader philosophy, this commitment to, and I love this term, kaizen, continuous improvement that really just permeated Japanese industry. And ultimately, their whole approach to economic development, and it's something we see even today in their partnerships in Africa. Japanese investment often focuses on skills training, technology transfer, that long-term view of building capacity, not just short-term gains.
It's a far cry from simply throwing money at a problem.
Yeah.
This was about a fundamental shift in their thinking, which I think makes the story of the Iwakura mission even more fascinating. The report mentions this, how in 1871, Japanese officials embarked on this incredible journey around the world.
The Iwakura mission. It's remarkable for what it tells us about Japan's mindset at the time. Here they were, a nation rebuilding from the ground up, and they're sending their best and brightest to learn from anyone and everyone. Western nations, former rivals, it didn't matter. They were hungry for knowledge. They saw the value in understanding different perspectives.
Talk about a thirst for knowledge. It makes you wonder how many nations today, facing, their own unique challenges, would be willing to embrace that same level of humility and openness to outside ideas.
It's a powerful lesson, and it highlights a crucial point. Success often requires acknowledging that we don't have all the answers. Sometimes the greatest leaps forward come from looking beyond our own borders, our own experiences. Which brings us to another nation that did just that, albeit in a very different way, Singapore.
All right, let's talk about Singapore then. Because if Japan was about rebuilding from the ground up, Singapore was more like building on a foundation of, well, not much.
An apt comparison. Remember, this is a tiny island nation, very limited natural resources. Their founder, Stamford Raffles, he saw its potential as a strategic trading post. but even he could hardly have envisioned what it would become.
And yet, against all odds, they managed to transform themselves into one of the most prosperous economies in the world. How? What was their secret sauce?
Pragmatism. I think that's the word that jumps out from the report when you analyze Singapore's journey. They weren't driven by some grand ideology or rigid doctrine. They were laser-focused on what worked.
And a key part of that was this commitment to good governance, right?
Absolutely. Singapore understood that economic success, it wasn't just about having a high GDP, it was about creating a system, a stable system, a transparent system, one that businesses and investors could trust.
And part of that involved thinking long-term, right? Even when they were making decisions in the short term. The report mentions their 1971 concept plan as a prime example of this.
The 1971 concept plan, it was visionary, really. A comprehensive blueprint for urban development. I mean, they addressed everything: housing, transportation, green spaces, infrastructure. And this wasn't just some, aspirational document. It was a concrete plan that they meticulously implemented, over decades.
So they were playing chess while others were playing checkers.
Precisely. And this long-term vision, it was crucial in overcoming, the limitations of their size, their lack of resources. They couldn't afford to think incrementally. They had to think strategically. They had to plan for the future they wanted to create.
Which makes their story all the more impressive. They turned their limitations into a catalyst for innovation, for strategic thinking. Now, speaking of incredible transformations, let's jump over to South Korea. This one almost feels like something out of a movie. From a war-torn, largely agrarian society to a global tech titan in just a few decades.
South Korea's trajectory is truly remarkable. It's a testament to the sheer willpower of a nation, determined to rise from the ashes of conflict and claim its place on the world stage.
And they didn't just participate in the global economy. They became major players. Samsung, Hyundai, LG, these are household names now, symbols of innovation, technological prowess.
Their success really highlights another key theme that emerges from this report: the power of human capital. South Korea, they invested, and I mean heavily, in education, in skills development. They understood that a highly skilled workforce, that was essential for competing in the global marketplace.
It's interesting, though, because their approach, it wasn't without its complexities. The report acknowledges that their rapid development, it unfolded under a pretty authoritarian regime.
True, and it's a reminder that economic progress and political freedom, they don't always go hand in hand, unfortunately. However, I think it's crucial to acknowledge the single-minded focus that South Korea displayed in building a globally competitive workforce.
So in a way, they prioritized economic development, even if it meant making, difficult choices along the way.
Their approach to land reform is a good example. They implemented this program designed to boost agricultural productivity, even though it involved, significant changes to traditional land ownership structures. It wasn't always easy, but their focus remained on creating a more efficient, more competitive agricultural sector.
It sounds like they were willing to challenge the status quo if it meant achieving their economic goals. Which, in a way, brings us to our final stop on this whirlwind tour of Asia's economic miracles, Vietnam. Because if any nation embodies resilience and adaptation, it's Vietnam. Talk about a dramatic turnaround. We're talking about a country that was, ravaged by war for decades, and yet here they are. A manufacturing powerhouse, attracting foreign investment, climbing the ranks of the global economy. It's almost unfathomable.
Vietnam's journey really is a powerful testament to, you could say, the indomitable spirit of human resilience, right? They emerged from the ashes of conflict, determined not to be defined by their past, but to forge a new path forward. And their story holds, I think, valuable lessons for any nation grappling with the legacy of conflict or adversity, really.
Because it's so easy to get stuck in that narrative of victimhood, right?
Wow.
To be defined by past struggles. But Vietnam seems to have, actively chosen a different path.
Absolutely. And their approach to economic reform, known as Doi Moi, it's a prime example of this forward-thinking mindset. Launched in 1986, Doi Moi represented really a bold shift from a centrally planned economy towards a more market-oriented system.
So they recognized, essentially, the need to adapt, to embrace new ideas,
Right.
even if it meant challenging long-held beliefs about how the economy, how it should function.
Precisely. And this wasn't about, blindly adopting a Western model or anything. It was about pragmatically assessing their strengths, understanding the global economic landscape, and then charting a course that made sense for their unique context.
And one of those strengths, it seems, was their agricultural sector. The report highlights this, the remarkable growth of Vietnam's coffee production. It's a tangible example, really, of their economic transformation. They went from being, a relatively minor player to one of the world's largest coffee exporters.
It's a fascinating example of how Vietnam leveraged its existing assets. In this case, favorable climate, land suitable for coffee cultivation, and they combine that with strategic reforms to unlock that economic potential. They didn't shy away from embracing global markets, and, well, the results speak for themselves.
It's a good reminder that economic success isn't always about reinventing the wheel, right? Sometimes it's about recognizing and maximizing the potential of what you already have.
Precisely. And in Vietnam's case, it was also about moving beyond their past and engaging with the world, but on their own terms. They didn't let, the legacy of conflict dictate their future. Instead, they used it, you could say, as fuel to propel themselves forward.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored these unique journeys: Japan, Singapore, South Korea, Vietnam, each one navigating its own path to economic success. It's almost like, I don't know, watching a masterclass in development strategies, each with its own set of nuances and insights. So as we start to kind of connect these threads, what stands out to you? What are some of the, I guess, the common themes that emerge from these very diverse Asian experiences?
That's a great question. And it's precisely the kind of synthesis I think this report really encourages us to do, because while it's tempting to look for, that one-size-fits-all Asian model, the reality is, as we've seen, far more nuanced. What we see instead are these common threads, these recurring principles that, while they're expressed differently in each context, they point towards I think, a deeper understanding of the ingredients for successful development.
So instead of trying to, I guess, copy-paste a specific model, it's about understanding the underlying principles and then adapting them to your own unique circumstances.
Yes. Exactly. And one of the most striking themes that emerges from these case studies, it's the importance of a long-term vision, whether it's Japan's, post-war focus on education and quality, Singapore's meticulous urban planning, or South Korea's relentless drive for this competitive workforce. They all shared this remarkable ability to think decades ahead.
They weren't just reacting to the present. They were actively shaping the future they wanted to see.
Precisely. And that often involved making tough choices in the present, prioritizing long-term gains over short-term political expediency, which isn't always easy.
Which is something I think that many developing nations, especially in Africa, really struggle with. The political cycles are often so short-term, so focused on the next election, that it's challenging to really implement policies that have a longer time horizon.
It's a real challenge, there's no doubt. And it highlights the importance of strong institutions, a clear vision, and then this commitment to good governance that transcends those political cycles.
Because without that, it's easy to fall into that trap of short-term thinking, of chasing quick fixes instead of actually laying the groundwork for sustainable, long-term growth.
Absolutely. And this is where I think the Asian experience offers those valuable lessons, not just in terms of specific policies, but in terms of mindset, of embracing a more strategic, a more long-term approach to development.
Okay, so long-term vision, definitely a key takeaway here, but it can't be the only ingredient in the secret sauce, right? What else kind of jumps out at you as we analyze these Asian success stories?
Well, another striking commonality is the role of the state. Now, before you jump to conclusions, I'm not talking about heavy-handed government intervention or stifling bureaucracy. What we see in these Asian cases, it's a more nuanced approach, what some might call developmental states.
Okay, so help me understand this. What exactly do we mean by a developmental state? How did these Asian governments kind of approach their role in fostering economic growth?
Think of it as a more, proactive and strategic role for government, but one that also recognizes the importance of the private sector. You see, in these Asian nations, governments didn't just sit back and wait for the market to work its magic. They took a more active role in, steering the economy, setting priorities, and creating an environment that was conducive to growth.
So it's less about the government picking winners and losers and more about kind of setting the stage for businesses to thrive.
Exactly. For example, they invested heavily in education and infrastructure. They recognized these were those essential foundations for a competitive economy. They also, streamlined regulations, created incentives for investment, and crucially, I think, tackled corruption.
So they were creating, in a sense, a level playing field, a predictable, a transparent business environment that encouraged investment, both domestic and foreign.
Precisely. And this is another key lesson, I think, for African nations. Attracting foreign investment, it's not just about, offering tax breaks or cheap labor. It's about creating a system that is stable, it's transparent, and it's conducive to long-term growth. It's about building trust and demonstrating a commitment to good governance.
It's about sending a clear message that your country is, open for business, that investments will be protected, and that the rules of the game are, fair and transparent.
Exactly. And that's a message that resonates powerfully with investors worldwide.
Okay, so we've talked about the importance of long-term vision, the strategic role of the state, but as we kind of delve deeper into these Asian success stories, it's clear there's another crucial element at play here, a relentless focus on human capital.
Absolutely. And it's not just about investing in education, although that's clearly a fundamental piece of the puzzle. It's about fostering this culture of learning, of adaptation, of constantly striving for improvement.
It's that concept of Kaizen we discussed earlier, that Japanese philosophy of continuous improvement.
Yeah. Exactly. And it's something we see reflected, I think, in various forms across these different Asian economies, whether it's South Korea's drive to create this globally competitive workforce, Singapore's emphasis on lifelong learning, or Vietnam's remarkable ability to adapt and acquire new skills. There's this palpable recognition that human capital, it's the ultimate driver of progress.
And it's not something you can just, assume will magically materialize. It requires deliberate investment, strategic planning, and a commitment to nurturing the talents of your people.
Precisely. And it's an area where I believe many African nations have tremendous, tremendous untapped potential. The continent has this young and growing population full of energy, full of ingenuity.
It's like they're sitting on a gold mine of human potential just waiting to be unlocked.
Exactly. And that's where the lessons from Asia become particularly relevant, It's about creating the right conditions to unleash that potential, to empower people with the skills and the opportunities they need to thrive.
So it's not just about replicating specific policies. It's about understanding those underlying principles, right? The importance of long-term vision, the strategic role of the state, and of course that transformative power of investing in human capital.
Precisely. And it's about recognizing that development, it's not a spectator sport. It requires active participation, a willingness to learn, to adapt, and to chart your own course, drawing inspiration from those who have navigated similar challenges before you.
It's remarkable, isn't it? We've dug into these Asian success stories, uncovered this, treasure trove of insights, strategies that have lifted millions from poverty and really reshaped the global economic landscape. But the question I keep coming back to is this: how do we translate these lessons into action? And particularly when it comes to Africa's development.
It's the question, isn't it? And it's where this whole deep dive takes on, I think, a new level of significance. Because it's easy to get caught up in this narrative of, well, Asia did it, so why can't Africa? Yeah. But as we've seen, it's never that simple.
Right, because there's no magic formula. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to development.
Exactly. Context matters.
Yes.
History matters. And each nation, each region, really, has to chart its own course, drawing on the lessons of others, but ultimately, forging its own path to success.
So how do we even begin to bridge that gap between, aspiration and action? Between learning from these Asian experiences and actually translating those lessons into meaningful change on the ground in Africa?
Well, I think for me, it starts with a kind of a shift in perspective. Instead of looking at Asia's success as some sort of blueprint to be replicated, we need to view it, I think, as a source of inspiration, a testament to the power of human ingenuity, and determination.
So it's less about literally copying specific policies and more about embracing, like you were saying before, those underlying principles that drove their success.
Precisely. It's about understanding that this long-term vision, the strategic investment, that relentless focus on human capital, these aren't just, abstract concepts. They're essential ingredients for sustainable development.
And that's a message that resonates, I think, far beyond, the boardrooms of multinational corporations or the halls of government. It's a message that needs to reach the streets, the villages, the hearts and minds of people across Africa.
Absolutely. Because ultimately, development, it's not something that can be, imposed from above. It has to be driven from within, fueled by the aspirations of people who are determined to build that better future for themselves and for their children.
It's about empowering people, giving them the tools, the skills, the opportunities to really become agents of their own progress.
Exactly. And that's where I believe the true potential of a report like this lies. It's not just a document to be read and filed away, it's a call to action. A reminder that the power to shape the future, it doesn't rest in the hands of, distant experts. It rests in the hands of those who are most invested in seeing change happen, the people of Africa themselves.
It's been a fascinating deep dive. I always love digging into these topics with you.
Always a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.